Jesus gave us a confidential briefing on a second coming. And this takes us then into this strange chapter, Genesis 6. And what makes this chapter difficult is that most Christians, even serious Christians, I believe, have been mistaught about this chapter. This is a very strange verse. The Nephilim, it's translated giants.
Chuck Missler explains some of the most fascinating Jesus predictions in the New Testament, and it brings it back all the way to the Old Testament. Absolutely fascinating. Let's get right into it.
This strange period of time that Jesus talked about, the days of Noah, also could be called the return of the Nephilim. Let's just jump right into it. Jesus gave us a confidential briefing on a second coming. 4 disciples came to him inquiring about his return. And he gave them an answer that's so important that it is recorded in 3 of the Gospels. He details all the preceding events, or many of them, that will occur prior to second coming. It's like a 2-chapter answer in Matthew. It's also recorded in Mark and Luke. Mark 13, Luke 21 following. Now, he opens and he closes that 2-chapter briefing with a warning. His first remarks, in effect, are saying, take heed that no man deceive you. We talk a lot about end-time prophecy, but we sometimes slough over the emphasis that Jesus placed in opening and closing this briefing. That deception is going to be the characteristic of that age. Deceit. We are in a warfare with Satan. And what is Satan's primary weapon? Deception.
Yep.
Let's keep that in focus as we go, because what motivated Mark Eastman and I to undertake a book and research and these talks and what have you is the burden that we feel that there is a cosmic deception descending not just on the planet Earth, but particularly on the body of Christ. And most Christians are not prepared for what's coming. Now, Jesus, in this briefing, also made a very strange prediction. He said, but as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, what did he mean by that? And this takes us then into this strange chapter, Genesis 6. And what makes this chapter difficult is that most Christians, even serious Christians, I believe, have been mistaught about this chapter. So just do me a favor and try to approach this chapter with an open mind. Let me point out the views I'm going to share I've held for many years, but I've always regarded them as one of those things that's open to conjecture. Some people have this view, I happen to have this view, and so forth. That's fine.
For when Jesus talks about in the days will be like as if it was in Noah's days, I always thought about it as in how evil and ungodly the people were. But I never would think about the Nephilim and how they were in the land. That is fascinating to think about. Like, what if that's the definition? I'd love to know what you guys think. Let's continue.
It's only recently I began to realize that, first of all, the alternative views are not really defendable, and I'll show you why. But more to the point, unless you understand Genesis 6, you will not understand much of the Old Testament, much of the New, and certainly have a prophetic blind spot. I'm going to show you a verse before we're all through today that many of us as prophecy teachers for many decades have read and taught and not looked at carefully. It's amazing how these verses that are so familiar to us sometimes will leap out at us with an insight that we've missed for a good part of our intellectual life. But let's go on. Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2 reads as follows. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things while I have this text on the screen. I want you to notice verse 1 and 2 are one sentence. That the daughters of men are the daughters that were born unto men in general. They weren't a subset. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that's men in general had daughters in general. You with me? Some people try to make, you'll see, I'll get into that later, that the daughters of men are a specific subset. There's no textual basis for that. But the real issue that should hit us between the eyes, what on earth is meant by the sons of God coming in unto the daughters of men? What's translated in English Bible, sons of God, is in the Hebrew, B'nai Ha-Elohim. Strange term, but here's the point. That term is used in the Old Testament exclusively of angels. Job 1:6, 2:1, 38:7 being well-known examples. The term, while it's strange to our ears perhaps, the sons of God is a term for a lot, and we could spend all morning on why that term is so carefully and consistently used in the Scripture for certain circumstances. You and I, we're products of John chapter 1, verse 11. As many as it believed on him, he gave power to become the sons of God. Different issue. That's used of believers in the New Testament, never used of believers in the Old. There's an equivalent phrase in Luke 20:36. Now, to corroborate this view, there was a book called the Book of Enoch. I'm not suggesting that it was inspired canon, but the point is, the Book of Enoch, as it's known in history, was highly venerated by Jewish scholarship from about the 2nd century BC till about the 2nd century AD. And I'm not referencing it because it's correct. I'm referencing it because it demonstrates what the vocabulary and grammar conveyed. Wow. The word sons of God, clearly from the Book of Enoch, were understood to mean angels. Let me give you a more authoritative.
Right, obviously, we all know. Well, not necessarily angels, because we all learned after watching Dr. Michael Heiser, angels means messenger, but spirit beings, created spirit beings by God, whatever that means. It could be, I guess, maybe angels. I don't know.
Example. The Old Testament was translated into Greek almost 3 centuries before Christ was born. The product of that translation effort is called the Septuagint. It is the version of the Old Testament that most of the quotes in the New Testament are taken from. So it's a highly authoritative translation. And it translates B'nai Ha-Elohim as angels. So there's no way to escape the idea that the text implies, in fact, expresses that angels, fallen angels obviously, came down and had some kind of communion, intercourse, with the women that were offsprings of Adam. That's what the text says. It's bizarre, it's uncomfortable to many, but that's what the text says. But let's go on. They came down to the daughters of Adam. The Hebrew says Banoth Adam. It technically says the daughters of Adam. Not Cain, not some subset, the daughters of Adam. Now, in subsequent verse here, in verse 4, it goes on to say something else. It says there were Nephilim, I'll come back to that word, in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown.
It's super fascinating because a lot of people think, the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, but for whatever reason, the Nephilim gets brought up in Joshua. They were in Jericho. They use that same word, the Nephilim. Are they being hyperbolic and being like, there's Nephilim there, we can't attack? Or it's like, there's Nephilim there, we need to be afraid. And Jesus says in the days will come that it will be like Noah. That's fascinating. Will we have Nephilim again?
This is a very strange verse. The Nephilim, it's translated giants. I'll explain why, in your English Bible. But the word in the Hebrew is Nephilim. But while I got the verse here, I want you to notice a couple of things. The Nephilim were the results of this unnatural union. The angels had intercourse with women, and their offspring were the Nephilim. Don't confuse the Nephilim with the fallen angels.
Right.
The fallen angels were the parents. The Nephilim were the offspring. Are we together? I want you to notice the offspring are males. There are children of them which became the mighty men. Doesn't speak of any mighty women. Now, I'm not being cute here. I'm not here. There's the reasons why I'm going to highlight this while it's in front of us. which were men, which were of old men of renown. The word Nephilim in the Hebrew means the fallen ones. It comes from a verb, nephal, which means to fall or be cast down, to fall away or desert. So Nephilim is a noun, a plural noun from the verb. It means the fallen ones. Also associated with it in that verse at the end, it says the Hagabarim, the mighty ones, the men of renown. When this was translated into Greek in the Septuagint, the word is gigantes. It was transliterated in our English Bible as giants. They did happen to be giants, but that's not what the word means. It comes from gigaz, which means earthborn. So the Hebrew translators really said they were the fallen ones. The Greek translators call them the earthborn. You'll see why as we go forward. Now, as we go through Genesis chapter 6...
That's confusing. Why are they considered the fallen ones if they were born on earth? Like, wouldn't the sons of God be considered the Nephilim, but they're not? So that's interesting.
Sets up this whole business of the flood. Genesis 6 is the prelude to the flood of Noah. And as you study the chapter carefully, you find some other strange remarks. In verse 9 of Genesis 6, it talks about the genealogy of Noah. These are the generations of Noah. We know what that means. That's a very common phrase in the Old Testament. Noah was a just man. Doesn't say he was sinless, he was justified. We know later from other passages he's justified by faith. Noah was a just man, and here's the strange remark, and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. In the English, you don't pick up on this, but in the Hebrew, it's tamim. The word is used of physical blemishes. Tamim means without blemish, sound, healthful, without spot, unimpaired. Throughout the book of Leviticus, it's used of offerings. They had to be perfect, without blemish, right? Tamim.
Wow.
Well, what does this mean? Noah...
Let me take a guess. It means that he's the only one that wasn't part of the Nephilim. His bloodline was not cursed or changed by the sons of God. Is that why? Is everyone else part of the Nephilim? That could be the case.
An unblemished genealogy. As you begin to read Genesis 6 with open mind, what it portrays is that as men began to multiply, fallen angels came down and began to contaminate the purity of the human race with these Nephilim. And the Nephilim were the source of unusual violence. It became so corrupt that in verse 12 of that chapter, he said, all flesh is corrupted this way upon the earth, that God sends the flood to wipe it all out, except for Enoch, which is removed early, and then the 8 that are preserved through the ark. Let me suggest another way of phrasing the problem. There was a gene pool problem
That's
in
crazy.
The human family tree that this is wiping out. Now, if this is true, the scripture says by a mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the thing is confirmed. If this view of Genesis 6 is correct, we ought to see it in the New Testament, and indeed we do in 3 places at least. In Jude chapter 6, Jude was, we believe, the Lord's brother.
Right, and I know Jude references the book of Enoch, which is also fascinating because a lot of people don't think Enoch is God-inspired, because obviously it's not written by Enoch, but I mean, I guess that doesn't matter necessarily, but it's not God-inspired.
He's talking about apostates, but he makes an interesting remark. He's pointing out that even the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of that great day, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Jude is making the point that these angels are set aside for special judgment. And what he's trying to say is, if they're set aside, how much more will you? You see, that's what he's...
Wow.
But the point is, he makes a remark here which tells you some interesting things. These angels left their first estate, kept not the first estate, but left their habitation. I'm going to come back later to that word habitation because it has some interesting insights. And this somehow involved, just as Sodom and Gomorrah did, fornication, going after strange flesh. Strange flesh. The word is heteros, not allos in the Greek, meaning flesh of a totally different kind.
So not even homosexuality, but completely towards a different species. Wow.
2 Peter. 1 Peter 3 also has a reference to keep it moving. I'll just take the one in 2 Peter. 2 Peter says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell," and the word he uses, that's the way it's translated in English, it happens to be Tartarus, I'll come back to that, "and delivered them under chains of darkness to be reserved in judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah," and he goes on. Peter echoes the same thing that Jude says, but he adds a couple of insights. He ties it to the days of Noah.
Huh.
These are angels that sinned. Where are they now? They are in a special holding place. They're not in hell as we think of it, neither Sheol nor Gehenna, someplace else. A place that Peter calls Tartarus.
Wow.
The word Tartarus only appears here in the Greek New Testament. However, we know a lot about the word in the Greek vocabulary. The word Tartarus is a Greek term for a dark abode of woe. It's the pit of darkness of the unseen world. It shows up, for example, in Homer's Iliad, and it's described as being as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. This is not just a regular place. It's someplace really special.
This is so crazy, guys. My mind is being blown again. I hope you guys are really enjoying this because Chuck Missler is awesome. He is fascinating. And I knew that God created hell, a special place for angels who sinned against him or demons who sinned against him. But also, it's not the hell that we're thinking of. It's also something totally different.
Now, I want to nail another alternative view down because many people in this audience probably, I will not ask for a show of hands, have been taught a different view of this passage. A very commonly taught view. And there are many outstanding, excellent authorities that happen to hold this view. But I no longer believe it's very optional for us. There are many things in the Scripture where good men can have different views. But I think it's important for you to consider yourself the viability of the lines of Seth view, because unless you go the other way, there are many other things that I don't think you'll be able to understand. Let me just indulge me, if you will. The lines of Seth view is a view that this word sons of God really refers to the faithful leadership of the Sethites. The daughters of Adam really refers to the daughters of Cain. And they were supposed to be separate. And the sin that's involved is their failure to maintain separation. There is no really good answers to what the term Nephilim means by this view. That's sort of, frankly, that doesn't have a good response. But that's not elaborated, but that's the essence of the Sethite view, that the sons of God really refers to the good guys, the leadership of the good guys, and they were supposed to stay separate from the Canaanites, but they married the Canaanites, the daughters of Cain, and they married and had offspring. Well, there's some problems with this. The text itself, the sons of God, is never used of believers in the Old Testament.
Right.
People who impute that view are bringing misapplying New Testament passages. And by the way, Seth was not God and Cain was not Adam. And I'm not being cute here. I'm saying that's what, in effect, they're imputing to the text. And by the way, there's no mention of the daughters of Elohim. So you got some problems. But more important is that there is a grammatical antithesis between the sons of God, daughters of men. You see, the structure is clear. In fact, in Psalm 82, it says, "Ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High, but ye shall die like men and fall like one of the princes." These antithesis shows up in the Old Testament several places. Also, the line of Seth infers that there's a separation they are supposed to keep, but that's a fallacy because the lines of nations didn't get separated until Genesis 11. We're talking about Genesis 6. This concept of separation was imposed upon Isaac and following.
Yeah.
Not beforehand. There's no textual basis for that. And by the way, Ishmael was not told to be separate. Don't assume the Arabs today are descendants of Ishmael. We can't prove it. Why? Because Ishmael never kept separate. Small point, but I just thought if there are any Muslims here,
I've always heard that a lot of Muslims or Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. Doesn't mean they didn't have like a pure bloodline, but that's what I've heard. But I'm totally on board with this argument for the most part.
I have something to offend everyone. I don't want to play favorites. But furthermore, Genesis 6, verse 12 indicts this view because it says all flesh was corrupted. It doesn't say that one particular group was the problem. The line of Seth also implies that, or infers, that the line of Seth was godly. Only Enoch and Noah's 8 were spared of the flood. There aren't any godly people there, except those 9. Also, the text says that the sons of God took wives of all whom they chose. You don't get the impression it was a participative choice. You get the impression they took wives. It doesn't sound like they're too godly in terms of prayer. That may be pushing something. Why did the Sethites, if they're so godly, perish in the flood? That's probably the real nail in that coffin. And by the way, Enosh, who was Seth's son, is the one that initiated defiance of God. Most people don't know this because there's a mistranslation in most of our Bibles. In Genesis 4:25, it doesn't say, then man began to call upon the name of the Lord, as the English would render it. It really says, then man began to profane the name of the Lord in the Targum of Onkelos, the Targum of Jonathan, Kimshi, Rashi, other Jewish, also Christian Jerome, Maimonides in the 12th century. The authorities that, if you really get in behind that verse, you'll discover that our English Bible has a misleading rendering of that. That in the days of Enosh is when apostasy began. And so it's a small point, but it does cloud the idea that the lines of Seth were good guys. The daughters of Cain, the implication of the Cainites were bad guys. Well, first of all, there's no basis for a subset of the daughters of Adam. That's conjecture. The Canaanites were not necessarily godless. If you study Cain's genealogy, following Cain in Genesis chapter 4, you'll discover in verse 18, many of his descendants had the name of God in their names. We don't know, but if you're going to draw a conjecture, it's more likely that even though he was guilty of that sin with Abel, that he repented and he tried to raise his family God-fearing. This idea that Sethites were good guys and the Canaanites were bad guys is a contrivance of liberal scholarship, not of the text. And by the way, were the daughters of Seth so unattractive? I don't quite understand.
Oh, man. I love how he does like a steel man. He makes some good points about why he thinks what he thinks. It's not just about their sinful nature or whatever. What do you guys think?
But the other issue is these unnatural offspring as a result of the union. What are these Nephilim? Now, they had supernatural offspring. Now, by the way, when a believer or an unbeliever gets married, they may have monsters, but they don't have, unnatural offspring. And also it implies that there were no X chromosomes among the Sethites. There were no women of renown, only men of renown.
Right.
And why was Noah's genealogy so distinctively highlighted in Genesis 6:9? Now, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, as I point out in Jude 6 and 7, 1 Peter 3:19 and 20, and 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5, even the unique use of the Greek term is fascinating. The New Testament seems to very clearly corroborate what I'll call the angel view of Genesis 6. So let me just summarize. We've got a problem with the text itself. We've got inferred separation, inferred godliness of Sethites, inferred Canaanite subset, unnatural offspring, New Testament confirmations. These are the major, in my mind, indictments of the so-called lines of Seth view, although it's held by many. But here's the thing that may surprise you. There's also post-flood events in the Old Testament and prophetic issues that you will be blind to if you adhere to the line of Seth view. Let's explore some of these. By the way, the angel view prior to the birth of Christ was in the traditional rabbinical literature, Book of Enoch, as I mentioned earlier, the testimony of the 12 patriarchs. It's not a member of the canon, but it does describe the linguistic structure of that day. Josephus Flavius, Septuagint. The early church fathers, Philo of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and the whole list, held the angel view. The early church believed in angels. Then where did the line of Seth idea begin in the 5th century? Celsus and Julian the Apostate used the traditional belief in angels to attack Christianity. And Julius Africanus resorted to the Sethite theory as sort of a more comfortable explanation. They're uncomfortable with the angel idea. And understandably, as we look at that, it's pretty weird.
Right.
Cyril of Alexander used the line of Seth to repudiate the Orthodox projection, and here's the problem. Augustine picked it up, and he embraced the Sethite theory, and it became the doctrine of the Catholic Church, and thus it still derives to the denominational churches, and it prevailed, of course, as the dominant view into the Middle Ages.
That's crazy. I think that's also very interesting for us to not, just because something's not popular or opinion is not like the most well accepted, doesn't mean we have to change our viewpoint on a lot of things.
Modern scholarship, and I just picked a few: Pember, DeHaan, McIntosh, Dillich, Gabelin, Arthur Pink, Donald Great Barnhouse, Henry Morris, Merrill Unger, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, of course Hal Lindsey and Chuck Smith as more recent well-known examples, are angel view people. If you've read Henry Morris's definitive commentary on the Book of Genesis, he, of course, goes into all this for us.
That's absolutely amazing. Who would have thought? I want to know what you guys think. Is Jesus just talking about how people are going to be as in the days of Noah, as in super sinful, not living after God's desires, living for their own fleshly desires, whatever that may be? Or is the Nephilim going to come? I'd love to know what you guys think. Well, anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you haven't. If you have never decided to follow Jesus, I encourage you to do that. Put your faith and trust in him. It will be the best decision you could ever make. Thank you guys so much for watching.